When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found the perfect place to settle down. The streets were quiet, the homes were well maintained, and the yards stretched just far enough apart to give each resident a sense of space and privacy. But as I would soon learn, in every seemingly perfect neighborhood, there's always one person who believes the rules don't apply to them. For me, that person lived next door, and her name was Karen. From the very beginning, Karen made her presence known. She had that air about her, constantly watching, constantly critiquing, constantly inserting herself into matters that didn't concern her. If someone painted their house, she had an opinion. If someone parked slightly outside the lines, she left a passive-aggressive note. She wasn't an official part of any homeowners association, but she acted as though she was the president of one she had created in her own mind. For months, I tried to keep my distance. My yard was my sanctuary, and part of that sanctuary was the sturdy wooden fence that outlined my property line. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple, well-built fence that gave me peace of mind and clearly separated my land from hers. I had the official property survey documents to prove where the line sat, and my fence rested squarely within my own legal boundaries. To me, that should have been the end of the story, but to Karen, it was just the beginning. It started subtly at first. I noticed her standing near the fence, peering over as if she was inspecting it. Occasionally, she would run her hand along the boards, tapping and muttering to herself. One afternoon, I caught her with a tape measure, stretching it across the ground like she was performing some kind of amateur survey. She didn't ask me any questions about it. She didn't knock on my door to raise a concern. Instead, she simply acted as if the fence were a personal affront to her existence. Soon after the rumors began, another neighbor casually mentioned that Karen had told them my fence was built on her land. She was apparently convinced that several feet of property actually belonged to her side of the yard, and that I had stolen it with my fence. At first, I laughed it off. After all, I had the official paperwork. I knew I was in the right. Surely she wouldn't take it further than idle gossip. But then one morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. The noise was unmistakable, the grinding rumble of a bulldozer engine firing up just beyond my window. My heart sank as I rushed outside only to see a construction crew lined up along the fence. And standing proudly in the middle of it all, like a general directing her troops, was Karen. She was pointing, gesturing, and giving orders, acting as though she owned the land they were about to tear apart. It was surreal. My fence, the one I had carefully installed and legally documented, was about to be demolished in front of my eyes, all because my neighbor decided she didn't believe in property lines. The crew hesitated when they saw me rush toward them, but Karen was quick to bark at them, insisting they continue. She told them she had authorization, that the fence was illegally placed, and that it needed to be removed immediately. Some of the workers looked unsure, but the presence of the bulldozer made one thing clear. If I didn't act quickly, my fence would be nothing but splinters within the hour. That was the moment I realized just how far Karen was willing to go. This wasn't just about a fence. This was about power, control, and her need to dominate the neighborhood narrative. To her, facts didn't matter. Documents didn't matter. All that mattered was her version of reality. And she was prepared to bulldoze, literally, through anything that stood in her way. I stopped the crew in their tracks that day. I demanded proof of authorization, permits, anything that would justify what they were about to do. Of course, Karen had none. She stammered, tried to bluff her way through the confrontation, but the workers weren't willing to proceed without legal clarity. Reluctantly, she waved them off, but the look she gave me said everything I needed to know. In her mind, this wasn't over, and she was right. That single event set off a chain reaction that would turn our quiet neighborhood into a battlefield. What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't the type to roll over and let someone destroy what I had worked hard to build. I had the receipts, the documents, the evidence, and soon I would use them in a way that would make her regret ever trying to mess with me. But revenge, like any good fence, requires careful planning and solid foundations. And while she thought she had the upper hand, what I had in store for her was going to cost her far more than she ever imagined. As I watched the bulldozer roll away that day, I knew this was only the beginning of a neighborhood war. And in wars like this, the one with the strongest proof always wins. The stage was set, the battle lines were drawn, and Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. After the bulldozer incident, I realized I couldn't treat Karen's behavior as a petty annoyance anymore. What she had attempted wasn't just neighborly bickering, it was a full-blown attack on my property rights. If I hadn't rushed outside, that morning my fence would have been destroyed, and I would have been stuck in an endless back and forth trying to prove what was mine after the fact. That thought made me furious, but it also made me determined. I knew the only way to win against someone like Karen was to be armed with undeniable proof. Facts, documents, and legal backing would be the only language that carried weight against her delusional sense of authority. So I dug in, literally and figuratively. I went into my home office, pulled out the thick folder of paperwork that came with the property, and laid everything out on the table. There it was. The official property survey from when I bought the house. It showed every measurement, every line, every boundary that separated my land from hers. I still remembered the day the surveyor had walked the perimeter, driving stakes into the ground to mark the exact edges. That fence wasn't randomly placed. It was built with precision based on professional measurements. Not only that, but I also had the receipts from the contractor who installed it, complete with the dates and specifications. Everything lined up perfectly. The fence was on my property. No gray area, no ambiguity. The more I reviewed the documents, the angrier I became, not at the paperwork, but at the sheer audacity of Karen's actions. She had acted like the law didn't exist, like her word was more valid than certified surveys and signed deeds. And that wasn't just arrogance, it was dangerous. I decided it was time to get ahead of her next move. I took the survey, the receipts, and even my closing documents down to the county records office. I requested certified copies, making sure I had multiple sets. If Karen was going to wage war, I wanted to be ready for every possible attack. While I was there, I learned something interesting. The clerk casually mentioned that this wasn't the first time someone had raised questions about that particular property line. Apparently, years ago, Karen had tried to dispute the same boundary with the previous homeowner. Back then, it never escalated to bulldozers or crews, but she had complained, filed nuisance reports, and spread rumors in much the same way. The difference was, that owner ignored her until he eventually sold the property and moved away. That little piece of history clicked everything into place. Karen wasn't just upset with me, she had a long-standing obsession with that strip of land. To her, it was personal, like a grudge she couldn't let go of. And now I was the unlucky one standing in her way. When I returned home, I noticed something unsettling. Karen was outside, pacing near the fence again. She wasn't alone this time. She had another neighbor cornered, and I could hear snippets of what she was saying. Lies about how I had stolen her property, how the fence was an illegal structure, and how she was going to have it removed no matter what. I didn't confront her then. Instead, I let her dig her own hole deeper. I documented everything, snapping photos and jotting down notes. I even set up a security camera pointed toward the fence line, not just for peace of mind, but to have video proof of any future incidents. With someone this reckless, it wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. And sure enough, Karen didn't back down. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't official. It wasn't from the county or any legal authority. Instead, it was a typed-up notice from Karen herself, declaring that I had 48 hours to remove the fence, or she would have it demolished at my expense. The letter was filled with dramatic wording, half-baked legal terms, and threats of lawsuits she clearly didn't understand. Reading it almost made me laugh, but I knew better than to underestimate her. Someone willing to bring a bulldozer to your front yard once could very well try again, and this time she might not be bluffing. So I decided to make the first official move. I called a property attorney. After explaining the situation, I emailed over copies of my survey, receipts, and Karen's ridiculous letter. The attorney's response was clear. I was fully within my rights, and if Karen attempted to destroy or tamper with my fence again, she would be liable for property damage, trespassing, and potentially harassment. That was exactly what I needed to hear. For the first time since this ordeal started, I felt the balance of power shifting. I wasn't just defending myself. I was building a case against her. The attorney even suggested something better: filing a quiet title action or a property line affidavit with the county. It was essentially a legal declaration that reaffirmed my boundary line and made it part of the public record. If Karen tried to dispute it again, she'd be fighting not just me, but the legal system itself. I followed his advice. Within a week, the documents were filed, notarized, and stamped by the county clerk. My fence wasn't just supported by a survey. It was now cemented into legal history. When I walked out of the records office that day with the stamped affidavit in hand, I felt a surge of satisfaction. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was proactively securing my ground. Karen wanted a war, but what she didn't realize was that she had already lost before the next battle even began. Of course, I didn't tell her any of this right away. I let her keep believing she was in control, watching as she strutted around the neighborhood, telling people my fence would be gone any day now. Little did she know, the paperwork I held in my hands was about to turn her world upside down, and the best part? When she finally tried to make her next move, she would walk straight into the trap I had set, one that would cost her more than she could ever imagine. The game was just beginning, but I was now holding all the cards. With the property line affidavit filed and the legal paperwork solidly in my corner, I felt confident that Karen would have no choice but to back off. After all, what could she possibly do against stamped county documents and a lawyer ready to defend me? In my mind, the matter was closed. But I underestimated just how relentless a person like Karen could be. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. To her, losing wasn't an option. She wasn't driven by facts, but by ego. And when someone's pride is on the line, they'll go to absurd lengths to protect it. The first sign came the very next weekend. I walked outside to mow my lawn, only to notice that Karen had set up a line of orange construction flags across the grass, on my side of the fence. She had literally walked onto my property, stuck little flags into the soil, and created her own imaginary boundary line. To make it even more ridiculous, she taped handwritten signs to the fence, declaring it illegal structure to be removed. It was laughable, but also infuriating. She was trying to create the illusion of authority, to make it look like some kind of official notice. I tore the signs down immediately, but not before taking plenty of photos. Documentation was my best friend now, and I wasn't about to let her antics slip by unnoticed. That same afternoon, another neighbor stopped by to chat. He shook his head and told me Karen had been making the rounds again, knocking on doors, handing out flyers she had printed up. The flyers contained the same nonsense, claims that my fence was built illegally, that I was stealing land, and that she had proof the county would soon order its removal. None of it was true, but her persistence was starting to stir drama among the neighbors. Some rolled their eyes at her, but others, especially those who didn't know me well, started to wonder if there might be some truth to her claims. That was the danger of a person like Karen. Even when they're wrong, if they shout loudly enough, people start to question what's real. I refused to let her control the narrative. I quietly showed a few of the neighbors the official documents and survey, reassuring them that my fence was completely legal. The looks on their faces said it all. They were tired of her games, and now they knew the truth. Slowly, her credibility started to crumble, but Karen wasn't done. A week later, I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. At first glance, it looked official. Big, bold letters, legal jargon, even a fake seal at the bottom. But when I looked closer, I realized it was another one of Karen's stunts. She had typed up her own code violation notice, claiming my fence violated zoning laws. She even included a deadline for removal, threatening fines if I didn't comply. The sheer audacity made my jaw drop. She had essentially forged a government-style document in an attempt to scare me. I couldn't believe it. But at the same time, I could. This was Karen, after all. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I called my lawyer. I sent him photos of the fake notice along with the earlier signs and flags. His response was immediate. Karen had crossed into dangerous legal territory, impersonating an authority figure, issuing fake notices, trespassing, and attempting to defraud me. These weren't just neighborhood squabbles anymore. These were actions that could land her in serious legal trouble. With my lawyer's guidance, I filed a police report. I wasn't trying to escalate unnecessarily, but I wanted everything documented officially. If Karen thought she could bully me into submission, she was about to learn that I was more than prepared to fight back. A few days later, officers paid Karen a visit. I wasn't there to hear the conversation, but I watched from my window as she stood in her driveway, arms crossed, her face red as the officers spoke with her. She gestured wildly toward my fence, clearly trying to plead her case. The officers, however, didn't look impressed. After about 20 minutes, they left, and Karen stormed back inside her house, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, I thought that might finally be the end of it. Surely, after a police warning, she'd realize she was in over her head. But no. If anything, it only made her more determined. The very next morning, I woke up to a new surprise. This time she had hired a private surveyor. I watched as a man in a neon vest walked the yard with measuring equipment, while Karen followed close behind, pointing and arguing. I couldn't stop them. The surveyor was allowed to measure so long as he wasn't damaging anything, but I already knew the outcome. Sure enough, a few days later I saw Karen waving a set of papers around in her driveway, loudly bragging to anyone who would listen that the results were in her favor. But when I got my hands on a copy of that survey, I nearly laughed out loud. The survey confirmed exactly what I had been saying all along. The fence was within my boundary, not an inch over. Karen had literally paid money to prove herself wrong. Still, she spun the narrative. She told anyone who would listen that the survey was inconclusive, twisting the language to fit her story. It didn't matter to her what the truth was, only what she could convince others to believe. But what Karen didn't realize was that her actions had already triggered something she couldn't stop. With every fake notice, every trespass, every false claim, she was building a case against herself. And thanks to the paper trail I had been collecting from day one, I had all the evidence I needed. It was only a matter of time before Karen's obsession would backfire in the most expensive, way possible. The countdown to her downfall had already begun. By the time Karen hired that surveyor and still refused to accept the results, the neighborhood had become a pressure cooker. Everyone knew about the feud. Some neighbors avoided both of us, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. Others quietly voiced their support, whispering about how Karen had finally met her match. But one thing was certain. The situation wasn't just simmering anymore. It was about to boil over. Karen was like a storm cloud that never drifted away. Every time I thought she had exhausted her tactics, she came back with something new. Flyers, fake notices, arguments in the street. It never ended. I tried to keep calm, to remind myself that the law and the facts were on my side, but there's only so much a person can take before enough is enough. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. It was early, the sun barely peeking over the rooftops, when I was jolted awake by the sound of hammers and power tools. At first, I thought someone down the street was working on a deck or shed, but then I heard the unmistakable crack of wood splintering, sharp and violent. My stomach dropped. I ran outside, and what I saw nearly made me lose my composure. Karen had called another crew, this time not a professional bulldozer operator, but a group of local handymen. They were halfway through tearing down one side of my fence, boards already piled on the ground. And there was Karen, standing proudly with her arms crossed, as if she were overseeing a construction project she had personally ordered. It was the boldest move she had ever made, and it was also her biggest mistake. I shouted for the crew to stop, and once again they hesitated. They weren't sure who to believe. Karen barked at them to continue, insisting that it was her fence on her land. But when I demanded to see their work order, their confidence crumbled. They had nothing, no permits, no paperwork, just Karen's word. I told them plainly that they were destroying private property and that the police would be called immediately. That was enough to make them back off. They packed up their tools and left, grumbling about not wanting to get caught in neighbor drama. Karen, however, was furious. She screamed across the yard, her face twisted with rage, accusing me of harassment, of fraud, of everything under the sun. It didn't matter that she had just orchestrated an illegal demolition attempt. She still saw herself as the victim. Didn't waste time arguing. Instead, I went straight back inside, pulled out my folder of documents, and dialed my attorney. Within an hour, the police were back at Karen's doorstep. This time, they weren't there for a warning. They were there for a report of attempted property damage and trespassing. I stood at a distance, watching as the officers confronted her. She tried to play the same routine, gesturing, yelling, spinning her story, but it was clear they weren't buying it anymore. I could see their patience wearing thin. Eventually, they handed her a slip of paper and walked away. Karen stood, frozen in her driveway, clutching the notice in her hand. She had just been issued a citation. It was the first official consequence she had faced, and for a brief moment, I thought it might finally put an end to things. But if anything, it only escalated her behavior further. The citation didn't humble her. It enraged her. Over the next week, she launched into a frenzy. She filed complaints with the city code office, called animal control on me, claiming my perfectly quiet dog was a nuisance, and even staged dramatic photo sessions near the fence, as if she were gathering evidence for a case that didn't exist. She was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Neighbors who had once tolerated her antics started to turn against her. One by one, they came to me, shaking their heads, apologizing for ever doubting my side of the story. Some even offered written statements describing her behavior, willing to back me up if things went to court. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now her credibility was in free fall. Still, she refused to let go. And then came the final straw, the action that would tip everything beyond repair. Late one night, around midnight, my security camera caught her sneaking into my yard. She had a flashlight in one hand and a can of spray paint in the other. With quick, frantic strokes, she scrawled the word thief across one section of my fence before darting back into her house. That was it. The moment she crossed the line, from harassment into outright vandalism, the last shred of patience I had evaporated. The next morning, I turned the footage over to both the police and my attorney. There was no denying it. It was clear as day. Karen had committed criminal vandalism, and this time there would be no wiggle room, no excuses, no fabricated stories to save her. The wheels of justice were officially in motion. And while she thought she could keep controlling the situation, she had no idea that her actions were about to cost her more than just her reputation. The breaking point had been reached, and what came next would be the reckoning Karen never saw coming. The morning after Karen spray-painted my fence, I woke up with a sense of finality. I wasn't dealing with petty harassment anymore. I was dealing with someone who had committed crimes on camera. I knew that if I didn't take decisive action, now she would just keep escalating until something even worse happened. So I gathered everything: the vandalism footage, the fake notices, the trespassing attempts, the photos of her crews trying to demolish the fence, even the flyers she had spread around the neighborhood. My folder, once just a stack of property documents, had become a thick case file, a paper trail of her obsession and misconduct. When I met with my attorney that week, he flipped through the evidence slowly, nodding as he pieced together the timeline. By the time he reached the spray-painted fence photos, he looked up and said exactly what I had been waiting to hear. It was time to file a lawsuit. The lawsuit wasn't just about the vandalism. It was about everything: property damage, harassment, trespassing, defamation, and even fraudulent impersonation of a city official. Each incident on its own might have been minor, but together they painted a clear picture of a neighbor who had crossed every boundary, both literal and legal. Filing. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, and by the end of the week, everyone knew Karen was being taken to court. Some neighbors were relieved. Finally, someone was holding her accountable. Others were nervous, worried about what kind of chaos she might unleash in retaliation. Karen, of course, acted like she was the victim. She marched up and down the street, ranting about frivolous lawsuits and land theft conspiracies. She even tried to collect signatures for a petition against me, but nobody signed. People were tired of her antics, and now that the legal system was involved, they wanted no part of her drama. The court date was set, and in the weeks leading up to it, my attorney prepared meticulously. He compiled every piece of evidence, cross-referenced timelines, and even contacted the police officers who had visited her house to request their reports. It was airtight. Karen, on the other hand, floundered. She refused to hire a lawyer at first, claiming she would represent herself. But when she realized how serious the charges were, she scrambled to find legal representation. Unfortunately for her, no amount of legal spin could erase the spray paint footage or the bulldozer incident. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Curious neighbors had shown up to watch, eager to see the showdown. Karen strutted, in with her head high, but her bravado faded quickly as the evidence began to roll out. First came the property survey and the affidavit from the county, proof that my fence was built exactly where it should be. Then came the receipts from the contractors, the photos of her fake notices, and finally the crowning jewel, the security footage of her spray-painting thief across my fence in the dead of night. When the video played, there was an audible gasp in the courtroom. Karen's lawyer buried his face in his hands. She tried to stammer an explanation, claiming it was staged or taken out of context, but nobody believed her. The judge's expression said it all. He had seen enough. The ruling was swift and decisive. Karen was ordered to pay for the full replacement and repainting of the fence, along with compensation for the attempted damage during the bulldozer incident. On top of that, she was hit with fines for trespassing, harassment, and vandalism. By the time the numbers were tallied, the judgment against her was in the thousands. But it didn't stop there. My attorney had also filed for legal fees, meaning Karen had to pay for my lawyer's time as well. The total sum ballooned into a figure that made her face go pale when the judge read it aloud. For someone who had spent months trying to tear down a fence she didn't own, Karen was now facing the reality of paying thousands of dollars for her obsession. The aftermath was brutal for her. She tried to appeal, but the evidence was undeniable. She had no case, no grounds, and no sympathy left from anyone in the community. Her reputation was destroyed, her bank account drained, and her standing in the neighborhood reduced to nothing. For me, the victory was bittersweet. I hadn't wanted a war when I moved into the neighborhood. All I wanted was peace and privacy. But Karen had forced my hand, and in the end, the law sided with me completely. The new fence was built stronger and taller than the old one, paid for in full by Karen's court-ordered payments. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded not of the stress she caused, but of the fact that justice had prevailed. Yet even as the dust settled, I knew Karen's story wasn't quite finished. People like her rarely accept defeat gracefully, and while the lawsuit had cost her dearly, her pride still smoldered beneath the surface. The neighborhood watched closely, waiting to see if Karen would finally learn her lesson, or if she would push herself even further into ruin. What came next would determine whether she remained just a nuisance or became a cautionary tale forever remembered on our street. When the lawsuit ended and the judgment came down, I thought that was the final page of the story. Karen had lost in the clearest way possible, in court, on paper, and in front of the very neighbors she had tried to convince for months that she was in the right. But endings like this aren't neat. They leave scars, whispers, and lessons that linger long after the gavel strikes. The first few weeks after the ruling were strangely quiet. Karen kept to herself, blinds drawn, no longer strutting around the neighborhood with her usual bravado. The yard that she once fussed over obsessively grew wild and unkempt. Her flower beds turned into weeds, and her lawn went unmowed. It was as if she couldn't bear to show her face outside, knowing that every glance from a neighbor reminded her of her defeat. Meanwhile, the payments began. Month after month, checks arrived from her, routed through the court system, chipping away at the thousands she owed. My attorney explained that if she failed to pay, liens could be placed on her property, and eventually she could risk foreclosure. The law wasn't just a hammer. It was a machine. And once it started moving, Karen had no choice but to be dragged along by it. At first, she tried to spin the story. I heard from a neighbor down the street that she claimed the judge was biased, that the video was doctored, and that she was the victim of a neighborhood conspiracy. But those words fell flat. Nobody believed her anymore. People she once bullied with her constant complaints now ignored her entirely. The social power she had once clung to had evaporated. The new fence, taller and sturdier, stood as a monument to her failure. Every time I looked at it, I saw more than just wood and paint. I saw vindication. I saw the proof that standing firm, gathering evidence, and refusing to be bullied could turn even the worst neighbor war into a victory. But the aftermath wasn't just about me and Karen. It reshaped the neighborhood itself. Where once people tiptoed around her, Now they felt emboldened. Neighbors who had stayed silent during her reign of petty harassment began speaking up about their own experiences. Stories surfaced about her filing nuisance complaints, reporting violations that didn't exist, and cornering people into conversations they didn't want to have. It became clear that I hadn't just been fighting for my fence. I'd been standing up to a pattern of behavior that had plagued the entire street for years. And slowly, the neighborhood healed. Block parties returned. People spent more time outside, and conversations didn't carry that undercurrent of tension anymore. Karen still lived there, but she was no longer the center of the story. She had been sidelined, stripped of her credibility, and left to stew in the consequences she brought upon herself. Of course, every so often, she tried to claw back some control. She'd send a curt letter to the city about some imagined violation, or she'd glare across the street when kids played too loudly. But the difference was clear. Nobody took her seriously anymore. Her voice had lost its weight. She wasn't feared or tolerated. She was pitied. As for me, I learned something important from the ordeal. At first, I had thought that staying quiet and avoiding conflict was the best way to keep peace. But Karen taught me that sometimes silence only fuels people who thrive on control. Standing up for myself, with facts, documents, and persistence, was what ultimately turned the tide. And it wasn't just about winning against her. It was about showing the neighborhood that bullies, no matter how loud, could be beaten. Months later, as the final payment cleared and the balance Karen owed was reduced to zero, I felt a strange mix of closure and relief. The war was over. The fence stood stronger than ever, and Karen had paid every cent of the price, financially, socially, and emotionally. She tried to tear down my fence, but in the end, it was her life that unraveled. And as the neighborhood moved on, Karen's story became less of a daily nuisance and more of a cautionary tale, one whispered at backyard barbecues and shared with new neighbors as a warning. The lesson was simple. In every neighborhood, there might be a Karen. But with patience, proof, and persistence, justice has a way of catching up. The fence that started it all still stands today, not just as a boundary, but as a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, a reminder that truth can outlast even the loudest lies, and a reminder that sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't shouting back, it's making them pay thousands for trying to tear you down.